Doing business in Africa. You can't afford to be without Africa Investor.
There's been a long history of essentially taking African assets or African development opportunities and really seeking to make the investment community that has a very different fiduciary mandate and really asking the investment community to make investment developmental, which is outside of the actual mandate. So that's just one key observation. The second observation that came out of all of these different initiatives and agendas is really looking at how we can ensure that we deliver on this need to incentivize this exponential increase in institutional allocations to African climate, African technology, and African SDG-related investments to close our $3 trillion financing gap between now and 2030 and then moving on to 2050. And I think the emphasis really needs to be placed on the words incentivized. We're now competing not in a world where we can develop a portfolio of projects and then take them around to our usual suspects, friends and colleagues, to see if the project is interesting. We're now working in a world of wholesale investment mobilization that's heavily incentivizing the private sector. An example being, we call them investment earthshots. In the United States, they have an investment earthshot known as the Inflation Reduction Act. Now, that Inflation Reduction Act in the last 12 months has been able to mobilize $500 billion of private sector capital for climate alone, which is essentially, in some cases, almost 10 times the amount that we as a continent have been able to mobilize over the last 10 years for all sectors for foreign direct investment. The fundamental piece of that is getting a model right, having a strategic plan to be able to incentivize capital to flow at scale. So the third point is, as we talk about this whole reform agenda that's designed to be able to mobilize private capital at scale, there's a bit of a misunderstanding happening in the market. The misunderstanding is that there's a presumption that an increased and optimized and leveraged multilateral development bank balance sheet is capable of closing the overall private capital mobilization gap for the continent. And in fact, the research has now shown that because of the size of the $1.5 trillion collective global multilateral development banks balance sheets, that at best, if all of the reforms are implemented, only 10% of Africa's financing gap will be met. So we absolutely need to really understand what has been called for. And what has really been called for is something described as climate investment statesmanship. It's really, I think one colleague said if our heads of state could have been here, they would have been participating in a very transformative conversation. I think a key part of our conversation is our heads of state are very, and rightfully so, involved on the public financing agenda. But we also have a 150 to a 200 trillion pool of institutional assets, both African pension funds and sovereign wealth funds and global institutional investors that have not really been engaged. So we've actually been calling for, these forums have been calling for more engagement with heads of state, which we're calling climate investment statesmanship, to create a new partnership which is known as an institutional investor-public partnership. And I'm happy to report that has not fallen on deaf ears. Those of you who would have been in the closing plenary yesterday for the Heads of State Summit, you may have heard President Ruto, when he was giving his report back on the outcomes of the Committee of African Heads of State on Climate Change, made a very explicit reference to the Heads of State commitment to work strategically and to work very pragmatically with both African and global institutional investors on mobilizing private capital at scale that supports the Nairobi Declaration, and of course a number of those elements also impact Agenda 2063. So, and the final sort of key observation was really that the paradigm shift is not coming, it is here, and that is one where we really need to look at a new investment and future fit business model to be able to attract private capital at scale. And I think it's one that's really much more predicated, as we've said, on not focusing on trying to make investment developmental, but being able to compete with the likes of the Inflation Reduction Acts in the US or the Net Zero Industry Act out of Europe, but rather seeing how we can take our sort of developmental endowment and really make that investable to get the scale and drive the industrialization. So that's hopefully just a little bit of context about the theme and the focus and the discussion that we're going to be having about making development investable. So we're going to focus in this panel on looking at some of the bankable investment models to scale private capital mobilization at speed, and really looking at some key sectors. We've heard a lot about infrastructure. Now we're going to delve. We have some of the foremost investors and minds and institutions on this panel investing in infrastructure. Similarly, ICT, agriculture. And of course, we have a broad understanding and a framework that we want to be able to provide input into called the Nairobi Declaration and Agenda 2063. And I think all under the African COP presidency, which really is designed to do two things in terms of engaging domestic capital, as well as then enabling that domestic capital to leverage and crowd in that 150 to 200 trillion pool of institutional capital. It's called an institutional investor public partnership. So I think what we are hoping, and we really look forward to under the leadership of the Executive Secretary, is to see how this forum can exist alongside each heads of state level African Union summit. Because we believe that this is an issue that really plays into this whole issue of what we're calling for, which is climate investment statesmanship. We want a conversation where the largest pools of institutional capital can support your engagement, can support other multilateral finance institutions' engagement like the Africa Club. As universal owners, we own public and private sector assets around the world. So we believe we can play a role. We want to play that role in partnership with the Africa Business Forum and the Executive Secretary and his team here at ECA. So absolutely got your point.
Doing business in Africa. You can't afford to be without Africa Investor.